Hello and welcome to Politics Theory Other. My name is Alex Doherty and my guest today is Phil Burton-Cartledge. We talked about the ongoing crisis of the British Conservative Party and whether there is a way back for the party that has dominated British politics for 2 centuries. We talked about whether the failings of Conservative leader Kemi Badenoch are particular to her or merely a reflection of deeper lying structural problems. And we discussed why it is that Nigel Farage's Reform Party has proven more successful in occupying the populist-right space in UK politics. If you find this interview useful, then please do consider becoming a £5 supporter of the podcast on Patreon. The show depends entirely upon listener support, and as well as keeping the PTO show on the road, you'll also get access to bonus content, such as the recent listener questions episodes with Richard Seymour. You can support the show in pounds or whatever your local currency happens to be, and you can pledge any amount you choose. Go to patreon.com/polltheoryother to sign up. Phil Burton-Cartledge teaches sociology at the University of Derby and is the author of The Party's Over, The Rise and Fall of the Conservatives from Thatcher to Sunak. So Phil, we're speaking the day after the commencement of the Conservative Party's annual conference in Manchester, which from the sounds of it is pretty conspicuously poorly attended this year. Apparently it was possible to book hotel rooms in Manchester just a few days beforehand, which is apparently not something that you could have done in the past. It used to be a bit more of a hot ticket than it is this year. Now, the Conservative Party is often described as being one of, if not the most successful political party of any parliamentary democracy. And the party has really dominated British politics since the 1830s. And most recently, the Tories were in office for 14 years until the electoral victory of Keir Starmer's Labour Party last year. The conference finds the Conservatives and their leader, Kemi Badenoch, at an unprecedentedly low ebb. Despite the extreme unpopularity of Keir Starmer and Labour, the Conservatives find themselves in third place in the polls, averaging around 16% behind both the Labour Party and Nigel Farage's Reform, who they're some 14 points behind. And in recent weeks and months, the Conservatives have suffered a string of defections from former ministers, donors and MPs, most recently and most prominently Danny Kruger, who was a member of Kemi Badenoch's frontbench team until joining Reform a few weeks ago. We'll come on to some of the more structural and long-term causes of the Conservatives' decline. But first, I wanted to ask you a bit about your view of the current Conservative leader, who's been in position for nearly a year now and who many thought would prove to be a difficult adversary for Starmer and Labour, and whether you think she is as flawed a party leader as she now appears to be, or whether, in fact, pretty much any Conservative leader would struggle in the current moment. After all, being the first leader after a prolonged and increasingly unpopular period in office is inevitably a bit of a thankless task.
Yes, Kemi Badenoch certainly has a poor hand, but she's also playing them poorly as well. Yeah, I certainly accept the argument that any Conservative leader would have a very difficult time of it. But the problem is that she hasn't adapted to the circumstances in which she finds herself. Because this time last year, going into Conservative Party conference season, in fact, if you read all of the accounts of Conservative Party conference, and bearing in mind they just suffered an historic defeat, their worst defeat certainly since the coming of universal suffrage in 1928, that they were actually quite chipper. You know, there was a certain element of confidence. They had a bit of a bounce in their step. And one of the reasons for this was the wide perception that Labour had really stumbled and fluffed their first few months in office, which I'm sure that most of us would certainly accept.
The non-honeymoon period of Labour's time in office.
Yeah, it was... as far as Rachel Reeves is concerned, it's like, we'll have none of that honeymoon nonsense. Let's get as unpopular as possible, as quickly as possible. So when Badenoch set out her stall, she had this view of, effectively, I'm going to have a year or two to kind of reflect philosophically, because she's tried to style herself as some kind of exciting Conservative thinker, to think about the problems that are facing the party, try to kind of re-articulate a conservatism that is suitable for this moment in time. And once we've got that philosophical basis in, that's when we'll start talking about the policy. But the problem that she's got, of course, is that Farage and Reform have risen really quickly. And I mean, this is a problem that, I'll hold my hands up. I didn't see this happening either, but that's probably because when I was thinking about the demise of the Conservative Party, I was thinking in terms of Farage not returning to British politics, but he has.
This was around the time when it looked like he might perhaps find something more lucrative to do in the United States.
That's right, yes. So you remember, people remember that just before the general election of 2024, all throughout April, May that year, Donald Trump's election campaign started to get into a bit of trouble. And it looked as though it was an outside chance that he was going to win. So Farage was looking forward to kind of spending more time in the United States. All of a sudden thought, right, okay, it's probably not worth my while there. And I'll come back. And as you know, because Reform was then his personal property, he was able to sack Richard Tice and install himself as the leader. And we know what happened next. And so Badenoch has kind of believed that she had this window of time, 1 or 2 years, in which to think seriously about what conservatism is and build a policy framework off that basis on that period of reflection. But as we've seen, of course, is over the course of the last year, Reform not only overtook the Conservatives, they overtaken Labour in the polls as well. And all of a sudden, the Conservatives have completely dropped from mainstream political consciousness. So they're just not part of the conversation in the same way that they've grown accustomed to be. So they've gone from having a privileged position in British politics to not having that privileged position anymore. And they find it incredibly difficult to cut through, to get attention and so on. So if you look at what's been going on over the course of this summer, you've seen how the Conservatives, or rather I should add, Robert Jenrick, the man who would be Conservative Party leader, has tried to get onto the news agenda, try and force themselves onto the news agenda. In Jenrick's case, there are a series of stunts, such as challenging ticket dodgers at London railway stations and also attending protests outside hotels that were doubling up as accommodation for refugees in Epping. Though, of course, Robert Jenrick himself is the architect of that policy. So we have the cynicism of a man protesting against the policy that he designed and implemented. And so he tried to get attention that way. Whether people paid much mind to it or not, I do not know. I don't think they did. But when you enter into Conservative Party conference this year, we've seen that Badenoch has finally abandoned her, well, I need to take a kind of a long philosophical view here. We've had these announcements of a series of policies, such as repatriating 750,000 people, an ICE-style removals unit to roam the streets of Britain. You have ideas around £47 billion worth of cuts, half of which will come from paring back the civil service, carrying on a policy that Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg previously championed under the last government. And also a tax on mental health services. They've decided that anxiety, depression, ADHD, these are conditions that aren't serious, and so we're not going to offer any kind of social security support for them.
Yes, it's a symptom of woke thinking, right, effectively, to have or seek such diagnoses.
That is it. It's a sick society, but of course it's not British capitalism. It's sick. It's the people that the system kind of chews up and spits out. They're the ones who are to blame. So she's trying to go for some really eye-catching policies that ostensibly compete with Reform. But the problem is that the Conservatives have got is they can only go so far. I was reading earlier on Conservative Home, you had David Gauke, the former Conservative minister, and sometime kind of held up as one of the good Tories by centrist politics and centrist comment. And he was arguing that, when you compare the Conservative Party and the Reform conference, at the Conservative Party conference, you'd never have a woman on stage who called for the burning of refugees. You'd never have someone who's so compromised by their links to Russia, though, of course, we can debate about the Conservative Party's links to Russian oligarchs just as much as we can in relation to Reform as well. But there's still this kind of idea that Reform are just more extreme than the Tories are. But their problem that they've got, of course, is that on the issues that the Conservatives are trying to contest Reform for its support, they've just proven themselves not to be credible on at all. So, for instance, Conservative Party under Boris Johnson always styled itself as an anti-immigration party. Taking back control was about taking back control of, quote unquote, our borders. But of course, if you care about issues around immigration, if you think there are too many people here, then under Boris Johnson, we saw the largest wave of migration into this country that we've ever seen. And so they've ceded the grounds of credibility on that particular issue to Nigel Farage. Likewise, we remember that when Rishi Sunak was Prime Minister, his big issue was, firstly, the Rwanda scheme to try and show how tough he was on immigration. We're going to send refugees to Rwanda, and stopping the boats. Stop the boats. You can judge me on stopping the boats. And so he was found wanting in both cases. So in right-wing terms, he has failed the right-wing test. And so why would anyone who believes in that kind of politics want to give the Conservatives a punt? That's the problem they've got.
Yes, and not merely are they not credible, but they are offering increasingly less so, but somewhat watered down version of what Reform are offering. So in some recent interviews, Badenoch and her Shadow Chancellor Mel Stride, and I think no listeners should feel bad at all if they've got no idea who Mel Stride is. I think you can be quite attuned to what's going on in British politics and really have a quite limited grasp of who the Conservative front bench is at this point. But Stride and Badenoch were characterising the Conservatives as the only party of fiscal conservatism, and they criticised Nigel Farage's call to abolish the two-child benefit cap, something which Labour were expected to do in November. And this seems very tone-deaf in this moment to be trying to position themselves, as usual, as the sort of the party of fiscal rectitude, at a time when the necessity of some kind of break with the status quo seems, I think, just ever more obvious to people. And that's perhaps partly why, for all that someone like former Prime Minister Liz Truss is mocked and became a figure of fun due to her extraordinarily short tenure in Number 10, she's still proving to have more of a sort of post-political death afterlife and maintains more popularity on the right, at least, than we might have expected when she was forced to resign, because she does still sort of represent a desire to break out of the status quo, which, at least when it comes to economic policy, Badenoch doesn't, right? She seems to offer, a combination of authoritarianism, but also austerity.
That's right. I mean, I would never describe Badenoch as an interesting politician, but in the first Conservative Party leadership contest after Boris Johnson resigned and she threw her hat into the ring, she did make the interesting point that Treasury control should be kind of muted in some way. And so that would have been a real break in the kind of the management, the style of management in British capitalism. But she rode back on that. And I suppose one of the reasons why she rode back on that, she's never explained herself. But the idea is that, as with the Bank of England and the so-called independence of the Bank of England, is that as long as they're under political control, there's an element of democratic accountability there. And obviously that was pointed out to Badenoch at some point, and why she has not gone there since. But you are right. She hasn't moved on. She is very much a status quo politician. So when I was listening to Stride's speech, it is a classic centre-right strategy, though, some of the stuff. So in addition to the ridiculous amount of cuts that they're promising, the £47 billion worth of cuts, there's a couple of things in there that are eye-catching. One of them was their pledge to abolish business rates for high street businesses and hospitality firms up to £110,000 on income up to £110,000 a year, which certainly would be a boost to a lot of small businesses. And then you've also got...
Yes, and the hospitality industry is under quite a lot of pressure at the moment, and not least because of the national insurance contributors policy of the Labour government.
Yes, absolutely. Incidentally, they've pledged to abolish that increase in national insurance contributions as well. So on the one hand, you've got a traditional Conservative offer to small business, but also as well, they've finally woken up to the fact that, maybe young people need a bit of help with housing. And so what they've offered is what they're calling the first jobs bonus. And the first jobs bonus is basically you qualify for a tax rebate after your first 5 years of work of up to £5,000, which you can spend as you see fit. And obviously they see that as a means of young people being able to get some way towards a deposit for a house. So they're thinking in their own limited way.
It's very optimistic, isn't it? 5,000,
yes.
I mean, yeah, okay.
They might be able to find a bed sit in my beloved old Stoke-on-Trent for something like that. But it's certainly not going anywhere else. And so, but again, they're on that kind of traditional centre-right kind of economics. But at the same time, like you say, the world has moved on and people are not interested in that kind of economics anymore. There might be some constituencies that are interested, that might think nostalgically like that. There will be people who are conservatives, who are conservative-minded when it comes to economics, who are put off by reform because of, Farage hasn't really got an economic policy because that's all secondary to what reform is about. But they might be worried about fiscal responsibility and all the kind of the traditional conservative issues. The centrist commentator turned Conservative Party recruit Matthew Said, this certainly fits into this mould. He's been talking about how Keir Starmer is some socialist, and so is Nigel Farage as well, because Nigel Farage wants to, as you say, lift the 2-child limit on child benefit. If that makes him a socialist, well,
that's great news for us. The two parties at the top of the opinion polls are both socialists. That's excellent. I was not aware, but yeah.
I know, it's what a time to be alive, eh?
Yeah. These statements around economic policy that the Badenoch and Stride have come out with recently. So this in some ways is quite belated, and perhaps partly that's to do with the long-term review that they were discussing around policy that you described, which was meant to take a couple of years and so on. But it has been noted by many of her critics that Badenoch has tended to focus on so-called culture war issues over the economy, and notoriously that she even sometimes will divert onto that terrain when specifically asked economic questions. Do you see that as a personal failure and a reflection of her own preoccupations? After all, she was not a part of the Britannia Unchained wing of the Conservative right, particularly, who were much more preoccupied with economic matters. Or do you think it speaks to a difficulty that the Conservatives have with articulating any kind of economic agenda at this point? I read recently an article on the decline of the Conservatives by Duncan Thomas in the latest edition of Salvage Journal. And he makes the point that the party was, at other times in its history, able to face down certain elements of British capital in order to chart a new path. Obvious examples being the embrace of Keynesianism in the post-war era, or Margaret Thatcher's attack on the so-called gentlemanly capitalism that prevailed in the City of London. But the party and the British state seem to have lost that kind of relative autonomy from capital, and the sort of the backtracking that you describe regarding Badenoch and the Treasury would perhaps be reflective of that. So do you see Badenoch's aversion to charting an economic agenda as being just a reflection of her priorities, or is it symptomatic of a bigger problem for both the Conservatives but also any political party, in fact, that seeks to change our economic model in a dramatic way?
I suppose it's both of those things. I mean, in the sense that even though she, during her first run at the leadership in after Boris Johnson, she was talking about, as I say, the abolishing the Treasury. But then when she came back in 2024, it was all about, as you say, the culture war stuff. And she touted herself as a culture war candidate. And we used to boast about how there was Minister of Equality. She really kind of didn't give two hoots about inequalities. And so, but you can make the argument that in many ways she was consistent with, I don't know if anyone's ever used this phrase, Sunakism, that when the economy started going wrong or things weren't being delivered or general conservative incompetence was high in people's minds, he tried very hard to go hard on immigration and culture war issues. Plus, as well, there's the belief that lots of people are more motivated by immigration. It's always like one of the top 3 concerns where people's issues are concerned. And they think that by being able to go hard on that, people will forget about the other things like the NHS, like the cost of living crisis, and go for the Conservatives on that basis. And I think she's very much along those lines as well, of trying to kind of establish the credibility of the party on those issues. because they haven't got a record to shout about on cost of living or on the NHS. But as we've seen, again, for right-wing voters, for reactionary voters, they haven't got a record to boast about when it comes to immigration either, so which is why they're on a hiding to nothing when it comes to culture war issues. I also think as well for Badenoch, she does strike me as a particularly lazy politician as well, like much of the Conservative front bench, quite a limited politician. She's not someone who has really kind of struggled in terms of politics. All the kind of issues that we saw during the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition government, which was, I think that David Cameron and George Osborne certainly had things their own way. But you had the big debates of the day. The Conservatives were kind of had to face the issues around equal marriage, and then the kind of never-ending issue around Europe and Brexit. Badenoch was marginal to those issues. I don't remember her at all during the Brexit debates in the latter part of the last decade. She was just a face. And so a kind of isolation from the politics. I mean, she's gone for the easiest answer in my view. So there is that element of the personal there. She feels more comfortable talking about those culture war issues because she can say things as extreme as she likes, and there's no way of coming back at her.
Yes, I mean, she specifically said that as well. That's not something we're attributing to her, right? She's come out and said, that Labour can't call me prejudiced and all this kind of stuff. Yeah. Another aspect of her very swift and quite smooth ride seems to have been that she became, a bit of a favourite of certain grandees of the party or media outriders. So, a particular favourite of Fraser Nelson, The Spectator and Michael Gove. And it perhaps does partly reflect that dynamic, that they feel she can sort of make the Conservatives bulletproof to the accusation of, being a racist party. Although ironically, that's probably less of a problem right now, right? If you're now trying to compete with Reform rather than, the Labour Party being your sort of primary antagonist, then maybe that's not really an issue so much.
It's probably one of the reasons why Robert Jenrick is kind of just bobbing around everywhere. Robert Jenrick seems to be the only man, apart from Kemi Badenoch, who's actually interested in being the leader of the Conservative Party, even though he's been defeated on one occasion. And the thing is that because if you like, the Conservatives of politics on the right have taken this openly racist turn, he feels that as a white man, he can be more openly racist and therefore more credible for the kind of voters they want to win over rather than Badenoch can. There's always been an element of believing that Badenoch's policies are not authentic, or that she's trying too hard to please people because obviously she's not white herself. Whereas Jenrick is a kind of a more, if you like, natural articulator of those kinds of views.
I don't know if you saw it, but there was this long profile of Badenoch in the New Statesman, and it was talking about the way in which elements of the Parliamentary Conservative Party and the membership more broadly are now starting to criticise her in sort of racialised terms. Some of it is around seemingly quite pedestrian things, sort of what she chooses to eat and what she likes to drink and this sort of thing. But also the accusation that she was a so-called anchor baby for her Nigerian family, and that her citizenship then enabled them to come over and all this kind of thing. And it does speak to the kind of hardwired racism of the Conservative Party that is more or less apparent at different points in history, but is always there. So just on the way in which Reform has been able to very successfully take up the space to the right of Labour, do you think that part of the difficulty that the Conservatives have is not merely the lack of credibility that they have around their policies because they've been in power for they had been in power for so long, that as compared with Reform, the Conservatives, they remain the legatees of a very old institution with a particular embedded way of operating and a particular way of relating to the public and the media that are maybe not particularly congruent with new modes of communication and political activity. And this is, also a problem that clearly stands for the Labour Party and their, risible communications operation. Whereas you compare that with the sort of fast-moving, socially media savvy Reform Party and the other sort of pop-up parties that Nigel Farage has been associated with in his career, they are so much more nimble and less tied tied to conventional ways of operating and interacting with both legacy media and social media.
Yeah, that's obviously an element to it. I think that for an element of the Conservative Party support, I'm talking about mass support here, there's a crudity to reform. I can imagine that when they watched, if any of them watched, the Reforms conference with its cheesiness and like fating of these people as if they're huge celebrities, I can imagine that some of them will find that quite repellent. That it's
a bit American.
Speaking, very, very American, very American. I mean, Farage has previously said, come to Reform Conference, it's a load of fun. But, for a certain generation who take their politics seriously, conference isn't supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be about ideas. It's supposed to be about listening to the leading politicians of the day and so on. Obviously,
sometimes it's also about just having a nap in the stands, right?
Yeah. But it seems that lots of the Conservative faithful decided that they can have a nap at home rather than have to go to Manchester and sit in an auditorium for one.
Yeah.
But of course, these people forget, that they showed exactly the same sort of behaviour around Boris Johnson when he was the kind of rock star Conservative Party leader. So there is an element of that. But I also think part of the problem that the Conservatives got as well comes back to their structural decline too. Because if you think the problem that Conservatives had was their core coalition tended to be older people generally and retirees in particular, and they weren't able to restart the political reproduction of their coalition. What Reform has done effectively is, if you look at their voter profile, is they have a similar problem, but it's slightly younger. So there's kind of younger layers of people that might have been leaning towards Conservatives. I'm thinking about people around about my age, the kind of the Gen X people who lean towards the Conservatives. Now they're going more towards Reform, partly because of these new techniques, because by and large Gen X people are also quite addicted to and social media savvy. They get their news from their apps. Even my mum gets her news from an app these days. They can see how Farage has blown up across social media. They can see how Farage upsets the political establishment. Particularly, we've got to remember now that Keir Starmer is the political establishment, and they upset them in ways that the Conservatives do not. And so if you want to if you feel a bit hostile towards the Labour government, who are you going to go for? You're going to go for Kemi Badenoch and her philosophical musings and her claims about not eating sandwiches and getting kind of basic facts wrong in interviews. Or Nigel Farage, who, regardless of what you think about him, is a really good media performer and oozes a certain kind of charisma, and also doesn't come across as a politician as well. He appears to be straight down the line. You ask him a straight question, you get a straight answer. And a lot of people really, really appreciate that. So I think that generational effect, if you like, the Conservatives have become even more sharply in long-term decline because they've lost their younger layers of their voter coalition. And, they're really staring down the path of existential destruction.
Yes. Yeah, I suppose on that point about how Nigel Farage is as a media personality and the straight talking and the idea that, you could have a chat with him in the pub over a pint and all this kind of thing, and the way in which the Tories struggle to replicate that. I mean, I wonder if part of that is just they just have the legacy of feeling like they are the natural party of government. And being in government conveys a certain kind of responsibility. It's harder to tailor your answers in such a way where, say, economic realities don't matter so much, which, is very true of Reform. They have the advantage and the leeway of just almost saying what they like because, they've never been in government. Whereas, I wonder if the Tories, there's always that sense of, we have to hew, a tiny bit closer to reality because we might have to actually implement these policies at some point, even if that's no longer the case.
Yeah, there's also the kind of the widespread feeling that was certainly widespread on the left up until recently. The Conservatives always used to play politics on easy mode, whereas any party to the left doesn't. And so that kind of leads them into a certain layer of complacency. And of course, this helped Boris Johnson. He was never properly scrutinised until he was. And then, of course, it all fell apart quite quickly. But the problem the Conservatives have got now is they're no longer playing politics on easy mode. Suddenly it's gone from easy to very hard to almost impossible. And they haven't got the kind of the people that can do the cut through. You haven't got the personalities. I mean, Robert Jenrick might be more credible on immigration related issues, but is he going to be able to contest Nigel Farage much more effectively than Kemi Badenoch is? No. What is the difference between Robert Jenrick and Badenoch? There's none that I can see really. And also, whereas Badenoch is seen as authentic, as in, someone who's always been a right winger and really believes what she says, at least in Conservative Party circles, Robert Jenrick is widely perceived both in the Conservative Party and outside of it, amongst Westminster and the commentariat, as being a deeply cynical individual who does not have any principles at all and will just say what he thinks needs to be said at any given juncture for his personal advancement. And the Conservatives know that, and this is why one of the reasons why Badenoch won the Conservative leadership. And it's also the reason why that if Badenoch is deposed, if anyone else runs against Robert Jenrick, I would not be at all surprised if they do well. No, I think virtually any kind of relatively well-known figure in the Conservative Party who's currently on the front bench could take on Robert Jenrick in a Tory leadership and beat him.
On that point you make about the long-standing critique from the left that the Tories playing the game of politics on easy mode. Obviously, a big part of that was the fact that the Conservatives had most of the press on side, and of course now that's a little bit less clear, right? Because if we take, say, the Telegraph, it seems more to be a paper that's supporting reform than the Tories at this point, even if they support many actual Tory policies. Just sticking with reform for a moment, if we are seeing this general kind of recomposition of the right around the Reform Party, in your opinion, which sections of Tory support, both at the level of business and donors and when it comes to their actual members and just ordinary voters, which sections do you think will go over to reform and which elements do you imagine might stay attached to a sort of permanently weakened rump Tory party that might be akin perhaps to the Republicans in France? And also, are there sections that might instead go elsewhere, that might go to the Liberal Democrats, for instance, perhaps over environmental policy to an extent?
You could probably make the argument that break has already been made. And so the people that have kind of moved over to the Conservatives, certainly working age Conservatives in large numbers have done so. You start to see a pattern that you see repeated on the continent where there's a traditional Conservative or Christian Democrat party and where there's a so-called populist-right or an extreme right party, the younger they are, the more likely right-wing voters are likely to go for the populist or extreme alternative. And this is what's happening here as well. So there's obviously something generational within right-wing voters themselves. So working age right-wingers certainly more attracted towards reform, but also as well partly because being working age, they're more right-wingers are more prone to the, if you like, the class politics or the kind of what I like to call the negative class consciousness or the negative class politics of the right, where right-wing views, where they appeal to working class or some layers of the middle class, they are usually framed around a kind of a beggar thy neighbour politics, of the sort that you have to work. So why are you having to support these people over here? It's kind of like you're in, your situation's crap, so everyone's situation should be crap. That kind of negative
solidarity. Yeah,
that's right. Yes, yeah. So I think that's the grounds on which those kinds of politics appeal. But of course, Reform is saying, we're going to get rid of all these immigrants, but at the same time, we're going to help you with your welfare, we're going to help you with your housing and all the rest of it, which is, classic continental extreme right policy from the extreme right policy recipe book.
Yes, the National Rally in France would be an obvious example.
Yes, absolutely. When it comes to the retired layers, again, I think the older retired people are more likely to stick with the Conservatives. So why change? Why change? They're not going to bother with that. But where it will be really interesting is what happens when it comes to businesses and big business in particular, because there's been some movement when it comes to giving money to reform as opposed to the Conservative Party. And we saw the memo that Sam Coates of Sky circulated before conference, noting that not only conference attendees are down, but business attendees are well down. And so are journalist attendees too. That at the moment, British capital has always been very mercenary about who looks after their interests. And at the moment, they're quite happy. There might be some grumbles, but mostly big capital's quite happy with what Keir Starmer is doing. There's no kind of big issues. They can eat the workers' rights agenda. Most of them have kind of, swallowed the national insurance increase and all the rest of it. But he's not promising to upend the Thatcherite settlement. It's only kind of little kind of tinkering around the edges here and tinkering around the edges.
And the national insurance contribution, that's more of an issue for smaller businesses, right? It's not a major problem for big business.
No, it absolutely isn't. They can say they can eat it. It's not. They're still enjoying quite healthy profits as a general rule. But the thing is that if the polls stay as they are for the next 4 years, as reform approaches power, we'll start seeing more and more big business flocking to reform if the Conservatives haven't revived, and it doesn't look as though the Conservatives are going to revive. And I think that will be the kind of the tipping point where more of their funds will come over. And effectively, when that happens, it's game over for the Conservatives. That's it. They're done, because British capital has now got a new vehicle. It's either Labour Party or Reform. And because of the nature of Reform and its propensity to authoritarian politics, if it is able to get in, who knows when we'll have another election after then.
Okay, so let's turn to some of the longer term problems facing the Conservatives, which it could be argued have plagued the party really since the early 1990s, notwithstanding their ability to continue to win elections from 2010 onwards. So there seem to be two major structural problems that the party faces. One of them you touched upon, that sort of inability to provide material rewards to enough of the population to secure stable Tory governments, partly due to the increasing difficulty of getting onto the property ladder and the encroaching workplace precarity of the middle classes, which, seems to be sort of feeding into the reform curious character of parts of the middle class and a sort of increase of that, paranoid style of politics. Another problem being something that was the case until fairly recently, at least, the sort of relative marginalisation of overt social conservatism in the country at large, an issue that was, particularly a problem for the Conservatives in the early 90s under William Hague and Ian Duncan Smith when Blairism was at its high point. The second problem relates more to the Conservative Party's internal character and the way in which the neoliberal reforms implemented by the Thatcher government have come to undermine not only the sort of thick set of relations and social institutions of the left and the unions, but also the Conservative Party and related institutions. I'll come on to that in a second, but first let's start with that first problem. How severe is the Tories' apparent inability to hold their voter coalition together through providing material inducements? And do you think there's anything they could do to rebuild that popularity? Is there some policy that if they were to be elected, they could implement, something along the lines of, right to buy and the selling off of council housing and so on? Is there any way for them to put their voter coalition back together on a, solid material footing?
I mean, there's never any kind of hard and fast yes or no's. There's no iron laws in politics. But if there are any, this is probably the nearest that we can get to one. I don't think the Conservatives can recover at all. The only way I could possibly see them making a comeback is if they effectively merge with Reform, how the Canadian Conservatives did in the 1990s after they lost nearly all of their seats in Parliament. They merged with a populist or extreme right upstart party, and they're able to kind of restart themselves on that basis. So that's probably one future for them. Is there another way back? I really can't see it. I mean, I was writing over the weekend and I often think about this, and I always used to think that the future for the Conservative Party, if they want a long-term future as the Conservative Party, does mean effectively moving more with the times. So that means thinking about the policy preferences of the rising generation of working age people and thinking about how they adapt themselves to social liberalism. The common sense that, racism isn't great, that people should just be able to rub along and get along in their lives regardless of their personal circumstances. The kind of weak social liberalism, if you like. They could, in theory, they could adapt themselves to that, but they don't. And part of the problem that they've got is that because they've made so much of social conservatism, they've effectively made social conservatism a location in British politics to an extent that it wasn't even like 10 years ago, that they built a coalition on that basis. So if they were to kind of make a socially liberal turn, which was more kind of, again, away from Thatcherite economics, where does that base go? Where does their current base go? It's very hard for a party to trade away one base in the uncertain likelihood of inheriting another base. I think the only party that's done it relatively successfully was the Social Democrats in Germany in the 2021 general election, and then they still end up being dumped out of power with 16% of the vote this year. So that's the problem the Conservatives got, is I think that they do have a future as a moderate centre-right party, but the means of them getting there, I just can't see how they can do it, because no conservative leader is going to want to lose their current base, lose most of their MPs. They purge, get rid of the people that have made the Conservative Party what it is today, which of course means there is now and it seems as though they've detected this, there's a space for that moderate centre-right party, and the Liberal Democrats seem to be moving a little bit more in that direction. If you listen to what Ed Davey said at his party conference in between his silly stunts and so on, that they seem to recognise that that's where the space is. And the Liberal Democrats have proven highly successful in winning over those moderate centre-right voters on that kind of moderate, quite socially liberal, but not massively so, that kind of weak socially liberal, but still pro-market, and we're the sensible people in politics kind of stance. So I can't see how the Tories are going to do it. I just can't.
Yeah, and I suppose on that point about the Liberal Democrats, the fact that it now increasingly seems that Britain is arguably a multi-party democracy in a way that it wasn't quite. I mean, it was always a three-party system rather than two, but it seems we're de facto moving into a situation where going forward, coalition governments are probably going to be more likely, and it's not inconceivable we might even see the implementation of PR at some point, that the Lib Dems have spied that, that they'll have the possibility of being the king, the sensible kingmakers who moderate people either to their left or to their right. So going back to that second problem for the Tories that I mentioned, so the way in which neoliberalism has in certain respects undermined the Conservative Party. So as of course you've written about, the Conservatives were at one time a real sort of mass party. They had some 3 million members in the early 1950s. They were the local Conservative clubs, the Primrose League at one time, and a very sort of tight relationship between local business and the party. Whereas in that article by Duncan Thomas that I point out, he touches on the fact that now in much of the country, the major employers are not relatively small-time local business people. They're big international companies based overseas that have much weaker ties to Britain and are therefore less concerned with the UK economy's global standing as a whole. So yeah, can you talk a bit about these sort of longer-term structural features of Tory decline?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's quite interesting as well. This was also known in the 1990s, the famous study True Blue that came out in 1994, which was a survey of Conservative Party membership. They actually surveyed, as part of it, they surveyed local, small business people or medium-sized business people, and a number of business people who were interested in politics. And they found that most business people weren't interested in politics even then as well. So it's always been a minority, if you like, the most class-conscious sections of business. And so you could make the argument that the Conservative Party has always been a vanguard party of capital. But this is a real problem that they've got, because the social glue has become much more atomised as a result of what Thatcher was doing in the 1980s, and has only been compounded since then under successive Conservative and Labour governments. Those kind of linkages, those kind of real lived social relationships that sustained the Conservative Party during its period of mass membership, where you could link your status in life to the circles in which you moved, to which there were certain political dispositions that came with that. So if you worked in a factory, you did well, you became the foreman, you could afford your own house, all of a sudden you're a cut above the rest. Then you start moving amongst circles. You start going to the local Conservative Association to meet other business people, meet aristos and so on. And it was part of a strategy of upward mobility. But so it's unsurprising that with the shutdown of mass social mobility, I've always found it interesting that the conversation about social mobility and its importance has emerged at the very point that's been shut down, is that without that social mobility, mass conservatism is no longer available. So it's not just being able to afford things and getting on the property ladder that turns people conservative, but you've got to think about, again, those social relationships that one acquires through being socially mobile are no longer open to the vast majority of people anymore. And also, kind of an understated aspect of this as well is the late starts that people are having when it comes to be starting their families. And also, people that never have families, unprecedented numbers of people in their 20s, 30s and 40s are not bothering having families anymore. And part of that is due to the cost of living, not being able to acquire property and so on. And it's often noted that if you have a family, that's more likely to give you certain conservative dispositions because you're going to engage in less risky behaviour, more unlikely to go on strike, for example.
Because you have more of a stake.
Yeah, you got to serve your mortgage, and that's, you don't want to, it's all right if you get turfed out, but having your kids turfed out as well. So that's a big problem that they've got as well. And I always find it quite interesting how in the 1990s, almost the Conservatives seemed to sense there was an issue around the family, and there was a big panic around single mums, as you probably remember, which was framed in terms of benefits, absent fathers, and all of those sorts of things. But the Conservatives don't seem to be bothered about the family anymore. They don't seem to talk about the family anymore. And even just going off on a little bit of a tangent, even the Blue Labour people that talk about the importance of social conservatism, they don't talk about families too much either.
Because they can't actually do anything about the material needs that undergird the nuclear family, right? Yeah.
That's right. You need a social wage if you want to be able to raise a family. And we don't have a social wage anymore, so it puts them on the spot. So unsurprisingly, they're quiet about it. That's another kind of structural feature of the death of the Conservative Party. And of course, it's still exacerbated by kind of their being in hock to social conservatism. And the fact is that with the rise of immaterial labour to cover the vast majority of working people, that is work that is based around relationships, based around, getting to know people, client relationships, service relationships, care relationships, production of data, the production of, I suppose, what you might call identities or subjectivities. This predisposes the wider population to a more kind of tolerant view, a more patient view, a more pro-social view vis-a-vis other people. And as a result, unsurprisingly, social liberalism has become a kind of increasingly the common sense for the vast majority of people.
Do you think that's still the sense, though? I mean, given that we are living in a moment of the revival of the populist right, that dynamic that you're describing of a certain kind of soft, weak social liberalism being hegemonic, that I don't know, was more the case during, say, Theresa May's time in office than it is the case now, given the energy that there is on the right?
I still think it is the case because the value surveys are very clear on this. Even, of course, there's no such thing as linearity in social relationships, but by and large, this tendency is still towards greater social liberalism, greater social tolerance, and so on. And you can see this still in every poll that comes out, where you see that where reform voters are concerned, there's that clear age gradient that the younger you are, the less likely you are to support reform. Even that despite all the hype around, all the young men tuning into to reform and being Nigel Farage fans and so on, it is overstated. I think the last poll I saw had something along the region of about 11% of young people are pro-reform. Whereas, another way of putting it is 89% of young people certainly aren't switched on to reform. And it's something like 7 or 8% are pro-conservative. So, you're talking huge majorities here against the party. So I think that tendency is still there. But of course, as we know, we're still embedded in a kind of an academic tradition in political science and political sociology that emphasises the importance of values more than material interests. But as we know, material interests can overwrite values quite easily. And so if Farage is positing something that appeals to a wide range of people, he offers a settlement that large numbers of people can take part in, not just the usual elite layers, as was the case under the Conservatives, but if there's something for poorer people, higher benefits, for example, families being able to get more lower house prices, a more generous welfare state, then there is a possibility that those kind of material interests can cut across what might be a socially liberal majority.
A related point to the effects on the Conservatives of the sort of atomization of society and the decline of those very concrete relationships that you describe between politicians and members of the party and local business and all of that. Along with that has gone a sort of an erosion of a certain kind of ruling class solidarity. And it seems to be the case that Tory MPs, although, I mean, you could say this is also true of a lot of Labour MPs as well, but seem ever more out for themselves. And, you know, they've always got one eye on their sort of post-parliamentary career, which is the place where you really make the real money. And this partly does seem to relate to the declining role of the aristocracy and politicians who were perhaps rooted in notions of public service and were rooted in the military even. And, you know, and this is something Aaron Davies writes about. And there's in fact a PTO interview with him about his book, Reckless Opportunists, which is worth checking out. And I wonder if this factor is something that the left perhaps has a bit of a difficulty perceiving, because we tend to view those old sort of aristocratic claims of being concerned with service and the good of the country as being just pure hypocrisy and simply a way to justify privilege. But that even if that is very substantially true, it doesn't follow that politicians and business people of an earlier age weren't more concerned with the health of the Conservative Party and also with Britain's economic position in the world, that even if they were out for their class, they were still in a certain sense authentic nationalists in a way which is perhaps less true of a lot of the political and business class at this point, who seem much more self-serving and just concerned with their future directorships and so on.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. I mean, perhaps the last Conservative leader who fits that mould was Theresa May.
Theresa May, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, she, even though obviously we disagree with Theresa May on all kinds of issues, but she seemed genuinely kind of a genuine partisan of the Conservative Party. She genuinely believed in it as an institution, and she genuinely believed in it as the kind of linchpin of ruling class power in this country.
And clearly appalled by a figure like Boris Johnson, right, who's the sort of the opportunist par excellence, right?
Yeah, absolutely, because she could see that he was in it for himself, but while he was in it for himself, he was kind of eroding the if you like, the collective political capacity and function of the Conservative Party as the kind of the key organiser, if you like, the modern prince of the British ruling class. And now that role has completely collapsed. I mean, there's certainly pieces of work to be done, and this is something I want to really start working on over the course of this year, on ruling class hegemony and its effective retreat, and how we're starting to see a kind of a decline in explicit notions of, or explicit ideologies of why the way things are. We're seeing retreats into more emphasis on violence, as we see in relation to the government and its repression of pro-Palestinian protests, but on other things as well. The emphasis on governance and digital and AI governance technologies to try and make sure that people stay on the straight and narrow, an increased emphasis on getting more and more people into work, so that disciplines people instead. So there's, if you like, there's what, you know, Lazzarato talks about, the machinic enslavements, which are these kind of components of capitalism that don't rely on consent. They're just kind of more or less the processes, the relays, the circuits of the system.
Yeah, it's not ideological. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, we're almost like in a post-hegemonic tendency within ruling class politics now. It doesn't even pretend to try and rule for everyone. It just, you know, it just goes for, and I suppose Trump in many ways exemplifies this. You know, he makes no bones about the fact that he's openly, you know, an oligarchical government who looks after his own interest and the billionaires' interests, is not interested in broad consent of people. And if you don't like it, well, you know, I can send ICE around, or I can send the military to your city, and so on. So this is a broader tendency that I think deserves a little bit more of an investigation. The Conservative Party, of course, are caught up in this. They reflect this. You know, they're a victim of this and they reflect this, but also an articulator of it as well.
Yeah, and the fact that any strategy for moving towards a higher growth economy seems entirely absent, despite the fact that, you know, Labour have sort of bet the house on growth, just compounds that tendency that you're describing, right? Because it's just not possible to grow the pie and sort of, you know, distribute some of the rewards to people lower down the income bracket. You just have to accept that some are going to do well and some are going to do badly, and those people who do badly will face repression in order to keep them in their place.
And this is why, in this particular context, Nigel Farage and Reform are the party of the moment, because they are openly an oligarchical party who will rule in the naked interests of British capital. And they're not particularly interested in winning over people who disagree with them, despite all their talk about free speech and stuff. They get into office, it will be, right, we'll close X number of university courses, we'll clamp down on civil society, we'll start regulating this, that and the other. We'll have, no demonstrations, or demonstrations will be even more heavily policed. And democracy will become a shell, just as we've seen in other kind of authoritarian states that have had some kind of right-wing strongman in charge.
You've been listening to Politics Theory Other. If you've been enjoying PTO and finding it useful, then please do consider becoming a £5 supporter on Patreon. The show depends entirely on listener support, and if you sign up, you can access bonus content, including listener questions episodes with PTO guests. Go to patreon.com/poltheoryother to sign up. The show's music and graphic design is produced by Planet B Productions. Thanks as ever for listening. I'll be back soon.